So thank you so much for everybody for joining us today. We're so happy to have everyone here for this talk. And we're also grateful to the African Studies Institute for sponsoring the event. For those of you who know me, you also know how disappointed I am that we're not together in person right now. But certainly that will not diminish from the excellent talk we're about to hear. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Martha Wilfahrt, who is an assistant professor of political science at the University of California at Berkeley. From 2015 to 2018, she was a Mellon postdoctoral fellow and then a visiting professor in the Department of Political Science at Northwestern University. Her research focuses on redistributive politics and state-society relations in sub-Saharan Africa, with a focus on West Africa and the Sahel. She's conducted extensive fieldwork in West Africa and published her findings in journals like World Politics, Comparative Politics, the Quarterly Journal of Political Science, and World Development. And her book was just published last year with Cambridge University Press, entitled Precolonial Legacies in Post-Colonial Politics, Representation and Redistribution in Decentralized West Africa, which she's going to be talking about today. So before she begins her talk, I just want to quickly note that we will have about 30 minutes at the end of the Q&A. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function, and I will ask them to Dr. Wilfahrt after her talk. So I invite everybody to join me in welcoming Dr. Martha Wilfahrt.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, even if only virtually. I was excited to visit Oklahoma. But I want to thank Natalie and the African Studies Institute for inviting me. So today I'm going to be presenting on the core argument of my book, which came out last fall, as Natalie mentioned. And my book studies the politics of public goods delivery in rural West Africa. It's also a book, however, about how long-run political dynamics, in this case, legacies of the pre-colonial past, impact local governance today. And I'm going to spend the next 40 minutes or so trying to tie that together and convince you that there is, in fact, a connection there. So I'm going to start by talking about two answers, contrasting answers that I was given to the same question by two former local government mayors in rural Senegal, where I've conducted over 14 months of field research for this project. And so I asked both of these former mayors what they were most proud of having accomplished during their 2 terms in office. The first mayor, who you can see on the left, explained that he was proud of helping all of his community, commenting that a leader should not leave people out or put politics before development. Across the local government, he claimed, everyone I talked to would tell me that he had done something to help their village. And in fact, this was by and large what I heard. When he was first elected in 2002, this first mayor continued, the first thing he did as mayor was to repair a well in a village that had not voted for him. I didn't want any enemies, he explained, and engaging in divisive local politics meant he thought that he would only lose later. And so he tried to do something in a village that hadn't voted for him, that he didn't think would vote for him, to this sort of symbolic gesture to sort of the type of leader that he thought he would be, or that he wanted to be, rather. So while the first mayor reflected on his broad engagement with the community, a second former mayor, located about 200 kilometers to the southeast, answered the same question by saying that he was proudest of having brought water to his village, as well as the village immediately neighboring his own, as well as for having built this health facility that you can see pictured on the right. So when he was first elected in 2002, the second mayor's village had in fact faced over a 10-kilometer journey to the nearest health facility, but so had most villages in his local government, meaning that his village was just one of many options that he could have chosen for this investment. And I would note that building a health facility is one of the most major investments that a local government can make. As many others argued in his community, his village was, not the best village, right? So it was a very contentious choice on his part. Importantly, while his village saw repeated investments during his time in office, other equally needy villages, some with larger populations, got nothing from the local government during his sort of 12 years in office. So the opposing political logics espoused by these mayors, right, one collaborative and the other widely seen as divisive, are not inconsequential. Both mayors ran one of Senegal's many local governments, during a critical period of social service expansion in the country. So for example, Senegal's local governments are responsible for building and maintaining primary schools. And Senegal during this time period built over 1,000 new primary schools. This would be the 2000s. And this decade also saw primary attendance rates rise from approximately 55% in 2000 to nearly 80% at the end of the decade, all while closing the gender gap in primary school attendance. So in my book, I try to make sense of responses like that of these two mayors. And in particular, I focus on understanding why some local governments embrace broad-based patterns of public goods delivery, such as that espoused by the first mayor, while others do not. So the first mayor's answer to my questions that he was proud of helping all of his community is out of sync with political science's dominant expectations for distributive politics. So most of our default hypotheses focus on one of two lines of argumentation. First, ethnicity has long been seen as a central political cleavage on the continent. And so we may then expect politicians to either favor their co-ethnics, right, to build up some type of voting bloc along ethnic lines. Or in a more bottom-up version of this argument, more homogenous communities might simply have an easier time overcoming collective action dilemmas to either co-produce or petition for investments. Secondly, following the widespread introduction or reintroduction in some cases of multi-party politics in the region, we've seen a large growth in work that focuses on how electoral logic, so notably targeting of core versus swing voters, shapes distributive patterns. More simply, we might just think that governments who face high levels of political competition, right, so who expect to face a competitive race, are just going to deliver more or do more, right, because they have to prove their worth in the face of challengers. And to this, we can add a third expectation specific to the sort of context of decentralization that I'm looking at, which is that local distributive politics, right, might just be in many ways a function of the central state's political ambitions vis-a-vis the countryside. So if the central state just provides unequal fiscal transfers, for example, then some local governments might just find it easier to do more for more people. So I've had a little traction to these explanations. They failed to convincingly explain variation in local public goods delivery in Senegal, nor do they explain the behavior of the first mayor very well. Looking across his local government, there's no evidence, nor even an accusation that he targeted public goods to co-ethnics or to meet electoral objectives. His administration performed as well as more ethnically homogeneous and more ethnically heterogeneous areas. Right? And the local state received the same amount of the average amount of local central government transfers, which are the main fiscal lifeline of local governments in Senegal. And like most local mayors, the mayor was aligned with sort of the national ruling party for most of his time in office. So I articulate a theory of institutional congruence to sort of explain the first mayor's behavior. And the theory essentially argues that politicians are more likely to deliver goods broadly across the local state when their political incentives align with their social ones. So I argue that variation in local government performance in decentralized West Africa is then the result of differing degrees of spatial overlap between informal social institutions, which I define as group norms of appropriate behavior in the public sphere, and the formal jurisdictional boundaries of the local state. So social institutions structure action for group members by rewarding behavior that is deemed socially desirable while imposing costly sanctions on poorly viewed behavior. They're institutionalized to the extent that they generate highly regularized expectations, right, on sort of what actors will do. Critically, social institutions inherit social relationships, and they're intimately tied to actors' identities as a member of any given public, right? And of course, individuals will belong and identify with many groups in their day-to-day lives, right? But the scale of the group identification can vary. And what I'm interested in is whether people's primary sort of local political identification, right, overlaps with the local state or not. In rural Senegal, I find two prominent social institutions. The first is sort of a strong norm about resolving conflict within a group through consensual dialogue. And the second is a strong norm that sort of community members deserve equal voice. I want to be very clear that, of course, there is inequality embedded within sort of even cases that I'm going to call high congruence, right? So, for instance, in many communities, minority groups, so immigrants or casted villages, things like this, will often get a form of tokenized representation, right? So they'll be allotted sort of one seat on the local council. And I think that we should think carefully about the implications of that. But the principle that certain groups, again, say a casted village, should have a say or should at least have one councillor is not universal in the country. The second thing I want to flag is that social institutions exist everywhere, right? So I visited very few villages in rural Senegal where people don't talk about wanting to resolve conflicts peacefully or through consensual dialogue. The key element that I want to highlight here is that the scale at which those social institutions apply varies. So in some areas, they're really seen as being bounded by the village or a clan, for example, while elsewhere they're seen as encompassing all or most villages of the local state. So this overlap will then produce high or low levels of institutional congruence. So when congruence is high, social institutions encompass most of the villages of the local state, if not all, and that raises the cost for local elected officials who are seen as overly partisan or divisive. When it's low, right, when we see low overlap between informal social institutions and sort of the jurisdictional boundaries of the local state, right, social institutions remain sort of at the sub-state level, say the village, again, ethnic or clan level, right, and politics tends to be more rivalrous and redistribution is targeted among villages. In West Africa, and here's where I'm going to bring in this sort of long-run persistence, and in particular in Senegal, my research indicates that social institutions, and hence the propensity of a local government to sort of have high or low congruence, right, is a function, I'm going to argue, is generated by the legacies of the region's pre-colonial political geography. The first mayor that I started the talk with is then an example of high congruence. His local government falls within the boundaries of the pre-colonial state of Cayor, and he reports feeling obligated to distribute goods broadly across this community as a result of where he falls spatially in the country. So to be very clear that my argument is not that pre-colonial centralization or pre-colonial statehood somehow produced uniformly better development outcomes, or that it produced more benevolent leaders, or that these politicians are somehow immune from political competition. None of that is true, but rather it's these enduring social institutions and their broader spread across the community that's constraining the political strategy of local elites in ways that I think are very consequential for public goods delivery and, importantly, spatially legible. Okay, so the remainder of this talk is going to be structured in 3 parts. I'm going to quickly introduce the institutional context of Senegal and explain how democratic decentralization reforms in 1996 and these long-term historical legacies of pre-colonial statehood together generate variation in institutional congruence. I'm then going to elaborate on the 2 mechanisms that underpin my theory by drawing on 3 local government case studies. And I'm going to conclude with some quick empirical tests of the argument's core observable implications to show that areas that were home to pre-colonial states do engage in spatially distinct patterns of redistribution following decentralization. All right, so quickly, this is the sort of institutional context of local governance in Senegal today. Senegal is home to nearly 400 democratically elected local governments in rural areas. There's a number of urban local governments as well. And since 1996, these governments have been in charge of constructing and maintaining primary education and basic health facilities. These aren't the only things they do, but these are sort of certainly the 2 biggest types of infrastructure investments that the local state will make, and they're the most consistent types that we see across the country. Because these local governments are home to numerous villages, only some villages will have a councillor in any given term. That being said, I think it's important to flag that at least in principle, these local governments are intended to function as multi-member districts. So elected officials are supposed to represent the entire local government and not just their own village, although many people complain that that does not work in principle. So sorry, I should have clicked. Those are the villages. Okay, but I want to zoom in on one local government to help shed light on this sort of coordination problem that's inherent, I think, in decentralized public goods delivery. So this is local government of Maka Yop in Kaffrine region. I didn't actually work in this community, but I think it illustrates, right, hopefully spatially what I'm talking about. So Maka Yop has about 30 odd villages. And so when we have the local state of Maka Yop created, and these boundaries are almost exclusively drawn in Dakar, sort of by central state officials, we have all of these villages have to decide, or local political parties have to decide who's going to make it onto electoral lists, you know, what count individuals will be presented as candidates. And that poses its own questions of sort of representation that I address elsewhere in the book. I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. But then once you do sort of see elections, individuals in the local council are going to pool from across a number of these villages, if not all of them, right? So the public goods delivery that I'm interested in is that ultimately a question of how any given elected council decides to cite scarce local public goods from amongst all of these villages, right? Given that these councillors are going to all have their own sort of specific preferences about redistribution. So I think most of the work in political science on decentralization has really come out of sort of work on elite capture. But most of that literature has focused on really village specific, or at the very least project specific outcomes. But here I want to sort of really encourage us to think about the local state as sort of an institutional space in and of itself, and work through the challenges that are posed by having sort of a number of different villages, each of which is home to its own political hierarchies and sort of social debates about sort of, deservingness. To recognize that decentralization demands that local politicians negotiate from across these villages, right? So in other words, decentralization poses a classic social dilemma for local officials. Politicians' individually rationality will incentivize them to prefer a distributional pattern that isn't necessarily optimal for the community as a whole, right? All right. So I'm going to argue that sort of these boundaries of the local state are then mapping on to sort of the pre-colonial or sort of legacies of the country's pre-colonial political geography. On the eve of the final French push to conquer Senegal in the early 1880s, approximately half of what we now know to what is today Senegal was home to a pre-colonial kingdom. Indeed, although it's largely unrecognized, I guess I'm speaking to an African studies audience, so it probably is recognized, but I think it's largely unrecognized in political science or outside of African studies. The microstate system of the West African Sahel was populated by states that, were really state-like, right? They could enforce property rights, they collected taxes, they engaged in diplomatic relations. These states also projected state identities across their territories, right? So in this way, Senegal is particularly well suited for studying the effects of pre-colonial statehood on contemporary development outcomes, because the country exhibits significant variation on my main independent variable. So again, sort of this legacy of pre-colonial statehood, all will allow me to keep sort of this formal national institutional context constant, right? So all of these local governments exist within sort of the same formal legal structure. All right. So one of my core claims is that pre-colonial statehood matters for the nature of contemporary local political parties, because these long defunct political units, right, left as an inheritance robust social institutions that today are repurposed and redeployed by local actors as they navigate their political worlds following institutional reforms like decentralization. And so this is due, I'm going to argue, to two mechanisms. So first, social institutions are again, sort of understandings of social behavior within a group, acceptable social behavior within a group, rest on a hegemonic local identity that encompasses the majority of the community. So it's been well established by social psychologists that group identities foster a sense of common welfare and increase cooperation among group members. Similarly, political scientists and economists have repeatedly shown that within group members are better able to overcome collective action dilemmas. The value of group identities is seen throughout rural Senegal, where comments such as this councillor's, who very dismissively responded to my question that asked him to sort of comment on political cleavages in his local government. And he sort of said, not impressed with my question. He said, well, we're all Cheddo. So the Cheddo is a reference to a warrior slave caste that was prominent in many of Senegal's pre-colonial Wolof kingdoms, one of whom's territory his local government falls within today. It's actually really improbable that all of the citizens of his local government descend from the Cheddo. But the councillor takes the category as self-evident, which I think illustrates how durable and localized understandings of identity persist from the pre-colonial past to shape how politicians and actors, citizens in general in these areas conceptualize their political relations. So I'm going to flag here that, of course, the identities that people are telling me about and that I think are important here are to a large extent mythologized, right? But I still think that sort of the narratives that sort of sustain these identities and sort of that harken back to some idea of a pre-colonial past are consequential because individuals take them as true or as meaningful in their day-to-day lives. So in this sense, these informal social institutions are creating sort of common sense notions about political and social life in a way that's really similar to how Leighton talks about this in his study of ancestral cities among the Yoruba, right? And I'm arguing that this is then sort of shaping politicians' preferences and strategies. Secondly, social institutions rest on and are reproduced by long-standing dense social ties between villages and local elites that date to sort of these foundational era of settlement during the pre-colonial era. So dense social networks circulate norms about behavior, as well as information about who does or does not uphold these norms. And this can then help explain why individual social relationships shape their social behavior. Reputational rewards can extend time horizons and render cooperation more individually profitable. This means that local elected officials in areas that have dense cross-village social networks are more likely to forego individual opportunism, such as diverting projects to their home villages or the villages of their family or co-ethnics, if they think their reputation will suffer. Rather, individuals are more generous to members of their social networks in anticipation of reciprocal exchanges. The density of social networks and the sanctioning effects it holds on behavior are then seen in this quote by this village chief who lived in the area of the former Sarah Kingdom of Sin. Together, then, these two mechanisms can help explain why communities that were home to pre-colonial kingdoms see constrained opportunism on the part of elites today. These local governments have a shared sense of identity and dense social ties as a result of these sort of pre-colonial pasts that stretch across most, if not all, of the local government's villages. When one or both of these mechanisms is missing, however, we find ample confirmation of some of the sort of maybe more pessimistic expectations about public goods delivery on the continent. Here, elected officials face acute coordination problems as local elites pursue the interests of their own village or subgroup at the expense of the community as a whole. So local political dynamics in these cases can manifest themselves in numerous ways. And I want to be really clear that I don't have specific predictions about when political cleavages might be about ethnicity or autochthony or, or caste or whatever, right? But in all of these cases of low congruence, we see sort of governance that might range from sort of just inaction to just outright dysfunction. And I'm going to argue that I think that these are rooted in the absence of one or both of these mechanisms. So first, in these cases, local identities are exclusive and non-hegemonic. So this can result, as I said, in cases where sort of it's really about, ethnicity, right? So this mayor in Tambacounda region said that, very explicitly, well, I ran to defend the Pul, the Fulani, who we thought had been sort of discriminated against and hadn't received their fair share under the previous administration. But elsewhere, again, this might be autochthony caste, more rarely religion, although I have heard these stories. It can also be partisan, and politicians have told me that they favor core voters, that they favor swing voters, right? I've heard sort of both of these dominant logics that we hear in political science. At the same time, these social networks are then fragmented across villages, right? We tend to not see sort of robust sort of friendship or family ties in these areas, and rather social networks remain sort of more fragmented. And here, as you can see in this quote from Kaffrine region, sort of one common outcome in these cases, although it certainly does take various forms, is that one or two large villages in a local government can effectively capture the local state. All right. So I developed this theory and the mechanisms that I suggest animated from a series of highly structured interviews of over 350 local elites in nearly 60 local governments that I sampled from across the country's pre-colonial political geography, but as well getting variation in ethnic groups and economic structure, et cetera, as well as archival research and historical process tracing. But for the rest of this talk, I'm actually going to go in reverse order. And I'm going to start by talking about, elaborate on what my theory looks like in these mechanisms by illustrating them through 3 in-depth case studies of local governments that I did as the sort of last stage of research. So I'm going to start with the local government that I'm going to call Cabamir. It's in the department of Cabamir. You can see the local government's boundaries here. So Cabamir falls in the heartland of the pre-colonial state of Cayor, but I want to be clear that sort of there's no pre-colonial capital, right? That this wasn't like, it was in the heartland of the Cayor, but this wasn't like the home of this, kings didn't live in this particular territory, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So Cabamir was originally founded by 5 villages, which you can see here in dark red. These 5 villages, at least the story goes, migrated together from the Jollof Empire to the east in the 1500s. The Cayor was originally a vassal of the Jollof. And throughout the pre-colonial era, we can then see sort of most of Cabamir's remaining villages are founded. Most of these villages would date themselves to about the 1700s. We see 2 more villages found during the colonial era. I would note that all of these sort of newish villages, right, were founded by individuals who either came from those original 5 villages or from sort of, equally old villages, like just across the border of the local government. I'm going to clarify that the one thing I think that a point that of confusion that I think often arises is that the boundaries of this local government are just a small part of represent a small part of the territory of the Cayor, right? So the Cayor itself extended far beyond these boundaries. And so of course, people's social networks also extend beyond the boundaries of the local state, right? The local state government, these particular boundaries were sort of drawn by, officials in the regional capital in Dakar, but no one thinks they had any say in them, according to a number of oral histories and interviews I did. So this rather strange delimitation doesn't actually correspond to any pre-colonial unit. There are some local governments that do more or less correspond. But in this case, we see a case where we sort of unintentionally, these boundaries are sort of netting a community into sort of a new jurisdictional unit, right? That's putting these sort of existing social political relations that extend beyond the boundaries sort of into a new institutional relief. Lastly, there are 3 villages that were founded in the post-colonial period. Again, all but one of them was founded by an existing community members, right? So people who found new villages as their village gets big, family spat, whatever. Okay, so this means that almost all of Cabamir's village date their foundation or trace their ancestry back to the era of the Cayor, which comes out in quotes like this, right? And sort of, I think this reflects sort of the how palpable the identity of the Cayor is in Cabamir. And these villages also have really dense social relations. As you can see here in this network analysis, these are extended family ties among village chiefs. This extends to friendship networks, right, which are also quite centralized when we look at them. And just to break it down by ethnicity, we can see that sort of these family ties also extend across ethnicity. So people are sort of marrying across ethnic groups. I mean, I don't want to overstate that, right? Most people marry within their ethnic group, right? But this does transcend ethnic relations. As a consequence, then, local politics in Cabamir is broadly described as sort of calm and cooperative. As the village imam mused one evening when I'd introduced myself, the best politics is the politics where everyone gets their part. The value of social cohesion, which is a term I hear a lot in historically centralized areas of the country, is then evoked in this quote by a village chief at the bottom, who, and this type of narrative is brought up sort of across the community, right? And directly is linked by individuals to sort of this tradition of the Cayor, right? That sort of, we have social cohesion, we have this long legacy, and we can't break that legacy now just because we have local politics. This doesn't mean that Cayor lacks political intrigue or competition. To the contrary, political competition is fierce. The local election that was held just before I was doing work there had seen some shenanigans, let's say. But across the community, respondents agreed that sort of following elections, politics was put aside, right? Sort of once campaigns were over, as local governments came to prioritize consensus and working together to solve local problems. Critically, local residents directly explain this as being a function of their shared identity of descent from the Cayor, and the fact, as people will say, like, we all know each other here. So institutional congruence looks really different. So here we can see a purely acephalous or historically stateless zone in the department of Kungal. In this area, pastoralists would have passed through this area in the pre-colonial era, but at the onset of colonial occupation, that most of the area was forest, right? And it was very sparsely inhabited and not really permanently so. So Kungal's first 2 permanent settlements were by 2 religious scholars who arrived from the west of the country shortly before the turn of the 20th century. Most of the community's villages were then settled during the colonial era, which you can see here in yellow. A number were further established during the pre-colonial era, particularly in the 60s and 70s. We also see a number of villages founded in the past 15 years, which you can see in green. In fact, there's 9 of these villages, so you might not notice them all because most of them are extremely small and meet no reasonable standard for a village. Many of these are just like 4 to 5 huts, and it's just one family. And rather, all these villages are then political allies of the previous mayor at the time that I was there, who would reward key clients with their own village in exchange for sort of their political loyalty, which is a particular form of redistribution. Kungal then just meets the definition of a low congruence case. The settlement histories recounted by Kungal's residents are largely individualistic or group specific, and the network ties reflect this. There is some clear clustering here, but there's little centrality across the board. Friendship networks are slightly more coherent, but a number of villages remain loosely connected, if at all. And when we map this onto ethnicity, we can see that the strongest cluster is among the Fulani, or the Pul. 7 of the 9 new villages were Pul villages, right? And so we do see some cohesive ethnic solidarity in that sense, right? But we don't see anything like hegemonic local identity that's going to help reorient local political politicians' behavior. In fact, although the Wolof have fewer villages, in no small part because the poll had just been inflating the number of their villages, the Wolof villages are larger, and the Wolof are sort of clearly the numerical majority in the local government. But the common lament is that, sort of as the local government secretary told me, the Wolofs lack a shared heart, right? And that they're easily divided politically, which is reflected in sort of their much weaker social connections amongst themselves, even though some of these villages are really large. So absent a hegemonic identity, the political strategies of both the current and the former mayor at the time that I was doing research are reflected in their respective comments that you can see here. So the former mayor said, well, there's no family in politics. And the politics, according to the second one, is best understood as a confrontation like chess. All right. So I'm going to lastly look at a case in Kumpentum. So although the community was home to a pre-colonial state that collapsed in the late 1700s, the state of the Nyani, today it's likewise marked by local congruence. So I guess I should clarify, the local government is home to 43 villages, none of which claim any actual descent from the area's pre-colonial state. In fact, only 2 villages that you can see here date their foundation to the mid to late 1800s. A number of villages were founded during the colonial era, and likewise, a number were founded in the post-colonial era. And again, these are all highly individualized stories of settlement in the zone. So importantly, the families that settled in Kumpentum only rarely share any relations. And as you can see in sort of the similar mapping of elite social networks, family ties between villages remain much weaker than in Cabamir or even Kungo. Here, the network structure is much more tree-like, and a number of villages report sort of no ties at all. Friendship is more centralized, but it's still pretty diffuse, and there's pretty weak inter-ethnic connections. Kumpentum is thus home to weak elite social networks and has no shared sense of identity. As the local clinic director told me, no one is proud to be from here, right? And people only think about their village. And so he didn't think anything was going to improve until sort of, people became proud of sort of the idea that the local government meant anything. While in Kungal, the perception was that the political allies of the mayor were favored, in Kumpentum, politicians were simply seen as sort of pursuing their own individual interests, right? So the mayor openly admitted to stacking the electoral list in his favor and lying to members of his community while doing so, right? So telling people that they would be on the electoral list when he had no intention of putting them on there to attempt to get the village mobilized to vote for that party. And he and many other politicians were pretty forthright in discussing the material benefits that they could obtain from being in power. So many village chiefs that I talked to sort of explicitly invoked that both the mayor and his predecessor had engaged in this behavior because they were not from the area, right? And that meant that they'd moved there as young adults. And so there was really a weak ability to sanction the mayor, right? Because they lacked social connections, right? And that this enabled the rapaciousness, in particular on the part of the current mayor. I want to say that Kumpentum is an important case for me for 2 reasons. So first, because the territory was the actual land we know historically had supported a pre-colonial state for 150, 200 years, it indicates that there's not some unobserved variable that both fosters state formation in the past and enables broad redistribution in the present. In contrast, it illustrates the necessity of a mechanism of persistence, right? We need something to carry these social institutions from the pre-colonial past into the decision calculi of politicians following decentralization. And here we have neither sort of a social network that sort of can date itself back to the era of the Nyani, nor the identity of the Nyani to do that. Secondly, although many village chiefs were perfectly aware that the area that they lived in had been the Nyani prior to their arrival, there wasn't a single attempt, veiled or otherwise, to claim that history. And I think this suggests that rural elites appear either uninterested or unable to latch on to a mythology of sort of pre-colonial glory in some sense, when they have no credible claim to doing so. In stark contrast, I think it's really important to stress, elites in Kumpentum were really proud of how and why their own grandparents, or in some cases fathers, had settled in the zone, right? Telling stories about, again, digging wells and clearing land, right? And I think this reveals how divided and atomized village identities can be linked to sort of histories of settlement in these cases in specific ways. So lastly, I'm going to zoom up to look at the subnational to look across the country to sort of examine sort of broad patterns of public goods delivery. So I'm going to attempt to establish sort of the empirical traction of the theory and sort of the ability to explain public goods delivery. So to do so, I'm going to draw on an original data set of about 14,400 official villages that exist in rural Senegal. I'm sure some new ones have been created since I was there, but this was the data that I think broadly captures almost all villages at the time of research. These villages are nested in 319 local governments between 2002 and 2009, and then 370 local governments between 2009 and 2012-13, which is the last time that I have elections. This split is because the former president, Abdoulaye Wade, engaged in some administrative unit proliferation. He created a bunch of districts out of sort of some political ambitions. I'm happy to talk about that. But this essentially allows me to sort of have a break around 2 elections. So the first electoral cycle at the local level was 2002, and then 2009, there was no elections held. And then 2009, the next elections were actually 2014. So my data sort of is short a year, but this sort of essentially captures 2 electoral periods. So the data set is then going to capture, measure the placement of new primary schools in all villages, and then for both time periods, and new clinics for a reduced sample of about 10,000 villages for the second time period, which is the only data that I could get out of the Ministry of Health. All right. So the first empirical challenge of this project is how I'm going to measure pre-colonial statehood. Although approximate borders of pre-colonial states can be found in early European maps, and I showed you an example of one earlier, there's substantial concerns about the accuracy of early explorers, particularly in the interior. So although some of the coastal states that the French long engaged in, like the Wallo and the sort of north of the country here, had sort of, pretty relatively extensive diplomatic relationships with the French. Other states that were really sort of expanding in this time, like the Bundu here, I think that there was a much weaker historical record on how we can think about measuring the extent of those boundaries. So we also know that many of our assumptions about territorial boundaries or of territorial powers extending within like a given bounded polygon is a pretty distinctly Western logic of state formation. So I opt instead to measure pre-colonial statehood as emanating outwards from nodes of power, sort of following the insights of Herbst. So accordingly, for each of Senegal's pre-colonial states, I did a lot of reading and historiography, and I spent a lot of time in the archives, and I attempted to create a list for each of them of the key sites of power for each of these states. So this would include things like the location of royal courts, key market centers that were important to local economies, provincial capitals, in some cases, religious sites, et cetera, that were sort of seen as sort of important places of sort of state authority from which we might think that power would sort of emanate outwards from sort of a series of cores. And you can sort of see all of those locations located here. It is in the key identified as pre-colonial capitals, but it is sort of a broader sort of set of locations that we think would have been important for the state to sort of maintain and be present at. So around these, I've drawn here in GIS 20-kilometer buffers. So 20 kilometers is, I'll be the first to admit, ultimately an arbitrary distinction, but it's a pretty reasonable distance for someone to travel on a very hot day by foot. And it also gives a pretty good approximation of sort of the more reliable early maps. My results, however, are robust if we extend this up to 30 kilometers and sort of think about these states as having a broader spread. But below 20 and above 30, I don't measure it in large part because I think that's when I start to see a mismatch with sort of the oral histories I've collected, right? So going to villages that are sort of on the margins and asking if they, about the history of the area, as well as, again, what we see in more consistent maps. And so that just essentially corresponds to sort of these local governments here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I just, I measured pre-colonial statehood in 50-year intervals from 1500 to, 1880. And then I apply a discount rate that's going to sort of penalize more distant experiences with pre-colonial statehood because I think we have reason to think that sort of the mechanisms I'm interested in would be sort of more likely to have disintegrated in that time period. So I'm then going to use these measures in a set of models as a proxy for where I think these informal social institutions inherited from the pre-colonial past are going to have been left behind, right? In other words, where are we likely to sort of see higher low degrees of institutional congruence? All right, so my first empirical test is going to be whether or not a village being congruent with a pre-colonial state, or the local government being congruent with the pre-colonial state, increases the likelihood that a village gains access to a new primary school or health clinic during the 2000s. So here you can just see a location of all of the new clinics that were built during this time period. And I'm going to follow here, I'm going to use here the Senegalese state's own working standard of access. Right. So the Senegalese state assumes that if a village is within 3 kilometers of a primary school, that we can consider that village to be sort of covered or have reasonable access. People could send their children to school if they wanted to, and 5 kilometers for a health facility. So in an event that a village had access in the baseline year, right, they already had access, I would only code them as gaining new access if that access improved. So for example, if a village was 2.5 kilometers from a primary school in 2002, and then they get a school in their own village, right, I would include that as an improvement, right? Models are going to include a set of controls, including measures for local need, local demand, and local geographic conditions. And I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. Okay, so I'm going to show some quick, but hopefully not too painful model results. So across a variety of model specifications, I find that a village is more likely to receive a new investment in health or education when it's congruent with the pre-colonial state. So if you look at the top here, these are the odds ratios from a series of logit models, which suggest that governments in historically centralized areas of the country, places where I think there's going to be high congruence, are improving the probability of access to new primary schools and clinics by about an equivalent of 5 to 10%. So the odds ratios are the high 2s, or I would say around 2. These results are robust to a number of model specifications, and as well as if I look at the construction of new classrooms to existing schools. And importantly, although I'm not going to show it, some of these common alternative explanations, like ethnic fractionalization, political competition, and central state favoritism, have null results, right? They don't appear to explain a village's propensity to getting a new investment from the local state during this period at all. I think an important question to ask, or maybe a better way to say this is, one concern is like, well, maybe this actually has nothing to do with local political dynamics at all, right? That this might just be the result of long run cumulative differences, which is certainly an argument that's been made about pre-colonial legacies. So elsewhere in this project, I go through a bunch of archival data to decompress history to see when pre-colonial centralization does and does not matter for public goods delivery. And so here I'm going to show one aspect of this. So this graph shows the average numbers of schools per department. So the inspection departmental is the local subnational sort of education unit. And this is the data for which I have the most complete time series, particularly in the post-independence period when, as I'm sure some of you can imagine, the 70s and 80s, it's really hard to find reliable data on these things. So other work on the effects of the pre-colonial past are going to assume that it would look something like this, right? So historically centralized areas are doing better, and they've always doing better. And maybe that accelerates in the 2000s when we see sort of the Millennium Development Goals and other things sort of produce an influx of cash for these types of projects. Right. But that's actually not what we see. And that in 1996, this era, when we see democratic decentralization reforms introduced, prior to that, centralized areas, historically centralized areas, are actually having sort of fewer schools per department, right? But we actually see a noticeable flip in the effect of pre-colonial centralization in the mid-1990s, right? And this, it's only following this change that areas home to pre-colonial states pull ahead. Similar results for health clinics don't show a flip, but they do sort of see a close parallel tracking where centralized areas do have slightly more clinics, and then they sort of radically the pattern shifts, and they sort of radically pull ahead as well. Similarly, if we just look at the same propensity of a village to gain access to a new primary school or health clinic over time, we see pre-colonial centralization only becomes significant post-2002. And again, here, following a real effort on the part of the post-colonial Senegalese government, by 1972, the direction of the effect is actually biased towards stateless areas, right? Although here you can sort of see that I have real gaps in the ability to get village level data because of stresses on African bureaucracies during this time. But what this suggests then is that the effect of pre-colonial centralization on public goods delivery is spatially path dependent, and that the effect is intermittent, and it's only unleashed under certain institutional conditions. The last thing I'm going to show you really quick is just that I run what we would call a placebo test, right, to look at the placement of central state allocated goods. So if this is, we could still imagine, well, maybe this is still about central state favoritism. And if that was the case, then we would expect similar patterns in central government delivered goods. But if we look at high schools, electrification, and improved roads, right, between 2002 and 2009, when I have the data, right, we actually sort of see that there's no positive effect of institutional statehood. And in fact, historically, acephalous areas are more likely. So these are odds ratios. So anything below 1 would indicate a negative relationships. That improved roads are actually sort of being biased by the central state towards historically acephalous areas. So just to recap these results, they suggest that at the village level, villages are more likely to gain access to a new service if they're congruent with the pre-colonial state. This effect only emerges after decentralization, and that there's no comparable effect in central government delivered goods. All right. So I want to conclude by articulating 4 key implications that I think my argument holds for understandings of contemporary African politics, but also for the increasingly popular question about historical legacies, which political scientists and development economists are quite interested in these days. So the first is that politically relevant identities may persist latently for long periods of time, only to be reactivated under certain institutional configurations. So we should be wary, I suggest, of assuming identity categories are static, right? And recognize that they can become politicized or sort of revitalized in new frameworks in a relatively short time, right? This means that if we only are looking for political cleavages that we expect to matter, say because they matter at the national level, right? So things like ethnicity, we might bias ourselves away from seeing identities that our respondents themselves are invoking when we sort of ask them about their political experiences, right? So national level cleavages might not be local ones. I think this is important, particularly important to think about in the wake of institutional changes, because the shape of changes to institutional boundaries can valorize old identities in new ways. Relatedly, secondly, even if these tales of pre-colonial grandeur that are repeated at length in some communities, really verge on myth or, start to take on a life of their own, the collective embrace of these narratives is a valuable form of data for understanding local political and social actions, explicitly because their retelling valorizes and reproduces social institutions. In this way, I think we should sort of think about studying these local narratives, right, as an explicitly political act. Right. I think this also suggests that sort of tinkering at sort of like the institutional edges of reforms like decentralization is probably not the way to go about thinking about improving outcomes, but rather that subnational local political outcomes depend on how these reforms are intersecting with these local narratives about belonging and community. Third, historical legacies are then conditioned by subsequent institutional reform, right? So I'm really emphasizing here the interactive effects between formal institutions and informal social institutions inherited from the past and the other. And I hope that by examining when the pre-colonial past matters, my findings serve as a reminder that institutions inherited from the past are intrinsically political creatures, right, that are amenable to reinvention and repurposing over time. Lastly, this research holds important implications for democratic consolidation at the grassroots. In cases of what we might think of as low equilibrium performance, where politicians are relatively unconstrained in their opportunism, we see sort of at times a near complete disengagement for a local state by numerous villages, which is exemplified in these, 2 contrasting, quotes from village chiefs here. And so in this way, I think my findings suggest that the forces often conceptualized as impediments to the state building projects, such as pre-colonial indigenous social organizations, may, at least in the short term, paradoxically serve to entrench the local state, right? I guess I want to just one last thing, and then I'll stop, was that, I recognize that my argument might be read as like all good things go together in historically centralized areas. But I actually want to sort of caution against that conclusion, right? Because delivering goods broadly across space is not necessarily the ideal criteria on which to evaluate local development outcomes. Highly populated villages with overcrowded classrooms could suffer if local governments prioritize giving, really small isolated localities their own schools. And nor, I think, is there something inherently objectionable about politicians rewarding those who vote for them, right? Or at least I think we should entertain that question. And so, although local social institutions about conflict resolution and equal voice may create some good outcomes, they carry with them profoundly anti-democratic aspects, right? And that in some ways, this actually suppresses robust democratic contestation, even if in the short term, right, I think it does create, it does sort of enable this new sort of institutional space to sort of graft itself onto society more readily. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilfahrt, for such a theoretically and especially empirically rich talk. I think it's just impressive, how much data you bring to bear on this really important question. So I only wish you could hear the spontaneous applause that I'm sure is erupting throughout bedrooms and living rooms in Norman, Oklahoma. But please, to everyone here, submit your questions about the talk through the Q&A function. There are a few questions here already, but I'll let a few more filter in. I have my own questions, so I'll start with one of those, which is one thing that I'm curious about, or to hear what you know about, is the drawing of these administrative lines. So you mentioned that this mostly happened in Dakar, and I'm curious in particular, like the case that I know best in Cameroon. As far as I understand it, for example, in the Bamileke West region, there's many sort of overlapping chieftaincies. And to the best of my knowledge, most administrative lines were mostly, they tried to draw around these pre-colonial polities. And so, you mentioned clearly in your talk how many of these pre-colonial kingdoms kind of got broken up in the drawing of these boundaries. And so I'm curious to hear if they used to be more unified, and in the decentralization process they got broken down further, or what exactly the process was in drawing these boundaries. And again, please put your questions in the Q&A function if you have them.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks, Natalie, for your question. Yeah. So I spent a lot of time trying to track this down. I mean, the actual sort of, so Senegal first engages in a heavily sort of state-led form of decentralization in the 70s and 80s. At that point, local governments don't actually have a lot of authority over anything. The ruling party still really decides everything. So it's really only in 1996 that I think we sort of see democratic decentralization. But finding that data on what happened in the 1970s is something that I've never successfully done. I know the ministry that should have the reports that were made, but the archives are, the archivist has quit. There's been a number of stories over the years, so I don't have that data. What I can say is this. So in the colonial period, sort of first, the early attempts at developing the canton under the French colonial state, I think there's some evidence that some of those did correspond to sort of what we might think about as the subnational units of pre-colonial states. But over time, and it's sort of attempt to trace this through a number of disparate sources, over time, I think some of the Cartesian visions of the colonial state are really come into play, and there's a numerous reforms to administrative boundaries over time, many of which are attempting to sort of create a relatively equal weight of population in each department, right? And then the French have preferences that each region be home to or each department be home to a certain number of arrondissements or canton, and then under that we get the local government. So then when independence comes, they get rid of the canton and the chef de canton, and again, they're attempting to come up with these very neat categories. So again, each department has 3 to 4 arrondissements, and then under there, once decentralization comes, they really aspire to create 3 to 4 local governments within each of these. And so at a certain level, some of those boundaries are determined by those types of things. What I do know about the actual decentralization process in the 70s, or sort of this first cut, and then there's been this sort of continuing subdivision of units over time, but that they we're often sort of looking for central economic centers around which to sort of draw these boundaries, because the goal was to attempt to sort of create a central location where the local state could be based. And so they would often go to where the SECO was, or sort of where people sell their peanuts, right? And that often became the local government capital. And so there's again a lot of this type of logic and attempting to pool a certain number of people to each of these ones. So I don't know the exact process for sure, but my sense is that there's a lot of other criteria that are coming into play versus sort of local preferences. On the ground, I've asked people extensively about the process, and I think only a few people have told me they thought there was any consultation. To the extent there was consultation, I think it tended to be with, again, socialist parties at the time, the ruling political party members, and about party support, right? So a more party logic. So I have never visited a local government that sort of says that their boundaries perfectly equate to a pre-colonial unit. But I do think in some areas, I think in Fututora in the north, I think there's maybe arguably more similarity than elsewhere. But yeah, I sort of have a half convincing answer, I'm afraid, to that question.
Well, it's interesting to think about all the sort of layers and decisions and historicity of it, and also how it might differ from sort of different cases.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to start with a question here from Felipe, who asked, do you know if the work of NGOs in these villages is also more extensive in pre-colonized areas or pre-colonial areas? I mean pre-colonial state areas.
Yeah, I'm going to have a slide on this. I don't know if I still have it in here. So I don't know this for the entire country because there's no like data set of like where all NGOs are. But I don't think I have it. But in the sort of this first survey that I did in 60 local governments, I like interviewed all of these local government secretaries and sort of asked them how many NGOs were present, as well as like how many like bilateral donors. So, the French or USAID or GZ or something. And there really isn't a correlation. Sort of, in fact, I would say the areas with the highest NGO concentration tend to be in the Casamance, which is sort of a post-conflict area, so I guess it's not entirely surprising, but it's also like the most like classic example of a stateless or a cephalous society prior to colonization. And so there doesn't really seem to be a greater density. I mean, I would say that all of these communities, I'm sure many people who've worked in rural Africa know, I mean, there's always projects, but like I wouldn't say in any of these communities that there was like a real felt, or that I've been to at least, that there's like a real felt everyday presence of NGOs, if that makes sense. It tends to be a lot of, people are working in a district, and so they might cite a project in the community, and that is done in consultation often with the local government. I don't like have the data to know about like whether that follows not prey, but that sounds a bit bleak, but like, right, whether that follows the same logic. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like, oh, well, the project was coming, but then we didn't hear from them, right? I mean, most of the investments I'm looking at, I guess it's a short way to say, are financed by the state. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. Okay, so we have two questions, one from Vincent and another from Ji Young, which I think sort of getting at the same question about the intersection between pre-colonial statehood and identity or ethnic identity. And so I think both of these questions are maybe sort of playing with this idea that oftentimes we think of pre-colonial state as being the same thing as ethnic identity. And so Vincent asks, what instances are local identities a positive influence on politics in an area, and when are they a negative influence? And then Ji Young asks, are the level of similarity of ethnic groups higher in the high congruence group than the low congruence group? Could the effect come from the distinctive characteristics, for example, economic activity among these groups? So sort of three interrelated questions there.
Yeah, these are great questions. Thanks. Okay, so just the first one, or Vincent's question first, so positive and negative influence on politics. I think this becomes loaded very quickly. So I want to be very careful that I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think when we have an identity and network that most local elites are a part of, right, that it constrains certain forms of political opportunism. Again, I mean, I will be the first to recognize that I think that comes at cost to, I think there might be reasons to think that sort of actually having some political contestation on your local council could be good for a long-run democratic, the establishment of long-run democratic norms, or for really, wanting, for example, different policy visions for the local government, right? And we really don't see any of that, right? It's all about these sort of valence issues of delivering development, and there aren't really any ideas about. I have yet to meet a local politician who has much to say beyond like, well, I'm going to try to get more donors, I'm going to try to get more money from the state, right? And that's not really necessarily, it's not really necessarily fostering like creative visions about like how local governments can develop. I mean, arguably these are too small of units to like really do much anyway. But so, I mean, in that sense, I think it's positive. I think that when we see high congruence, it's positive in the sense that sort of it prevents, but at times it's pretty bitter infighting. I mean, there are times when like I visited local governments or worked in local governments where like there's just almost nothing happening because of infighting. And I think like, I guess I would say it's better to like build schools than not build schools. But again, I mean, I think that we shouldn't, assume that that like means everything is positive in these areas. As for the question about sort of the ethnic identity, this is interesting. I guess one thing I should have said when I introduced my 3 case studies is that these actually had really similar ethnic dynamics. So they were all about like 70 to 80% ethnically Wolof, which is the largest ethnic group in Senegal. And then most of the remaining minority was Fulani, although there was a bit of Serer, in one case more in each of them. So yeah, so this is a super great question. I think a lot of the like work by economists on pre-colonial centralization assumes that there's somehow like they like to talk about like ethnic norms. Like the reason we see long run benefits is these ethnic norms that have persisted over time. But I actually find that sort of once you have sort of like a Wolof population, for instance, that is strongly associated with some of the most prominent pre-colonial kingdoms in the country, when they have migrated elsewhere, we don't see those sort of the same reproduction of that institutional congruence, right? And so I think here, like it's back to that nature of those settlement patterns and like the ways in which those identities are rooted in place that is really powerful and doing a lot of work in this story, right? And so in that sense, there really isn't, I think, something about the ethnic group itself that matters, right? Similarly, if we think about the Fulani, sort of, where maybe we would think that, there's pastoralism, maybe like there's something distinct in the economic activity. I mean, likewise, if we go to like Fututoro or the Bundu, which were pre-colonial states versus, there's numerous Fulani populations across the country, I don't really see like a carryover of those, that same idea of sort of like the norms and the identities, and I think are doing the work.
Thank you. That's I feel like it's a lot to sort of wrap your head around with all of the variation that's going on subnationally. So it's really interesting to think about how this might vary in different contexts. The next question is from Shauna, who is, I think, curious about your research design. And she asks, how do you decide where to collect data from?
Yeah, well, the long story is that I was originally going to do this project in Mali, and then I couldn't because it was a coup and Mali's quick turn in fate. So I switched to Senegal because, so just if anyone had their projects interrupted by COVID or anything, it is possible to pivot. So within Senegal, when I did this sort of like first survey broadly across local governments, I tried to sample on like areas that I knew had pre-colonial states and areas that didn't, but also getting sort of like ethnic matches to sort of address this previous question, and also like economic structure, and as well as things like distance from Dakar, right? Like there's lots of reasons to think that if you're really close to the capital or the coast, right, you just might have an easier access getting donors to come see you, et cetera, or the state to care about you. So that was the first round. And then I got the data set as like extensive, like the large in data as extensively as I could, mostly through tracking persistently down ministers or people at ministries, archivists at ministries. And then for the case studies, it's interesting. I mean, I had to think about, I didn't want to go to the communities I'd already been to, which actually sort of posed a problem in getting these areas that like had states that had disappeared. And so I was trying to think about a balance between like similar population size, similar number of villages, similar ethnic composition, and similar sort of like baseline levels of development in 2002. And that just really created a small number of pairs that were available to me. And I guess I should flag here for students who are doing research, like this is never a perfect exercise. So when I got to the case of Kungal, for example, all of a sudden there was like essentially 10 more villages than I thought, which means it has way more villages than my other local governments. But because of this politics of like village creation, which I actually think is super interesting data for what I'm interested in. But at first I was like, I'd already done a case study and I was like, oh no, like it's all blowing up in my face. Because it suddenly did have like, it's just harder to deliver goods to 55 villages versus, 40 to 45 villages, right? So, nothing's perfect.
Okay, so the next question is from Garrett. He says, first, thank you for the talk. I found it informative and convincing. I noticed in the network analysis of your low congruence example that there was a high number of, quote, colonial ties. To clarify, are these ties from the colonial period, as in the time period, or are they colonial in that they stem from colonial offices or anti-colonial movements? How do you view the effect of anti-colonial identities in your argument? Hypothetically, these identities would also overlap with political organizations.
Yes, I'm going to be annoying and go back. I should have been clearer here. So each of these, I'm sorry, I totally forgot to introduce this. Each of these dots is a village chief that I interviewed, and these are his reported ties. I also have ties with local elected officials. I didn't include those here. So the colors here are the date the village was founded, right? So a pre-colonial village means the village was founded prior to the onset of colonial rule. The colonial rule means these villages were founded during the colonial period, and then blue are the post-colonial period, right? So this essentially just reflects like the era of settlement. So if we go back like to Kungal, we can see that sort of like arguably most villages are founded in like the colonial period, if that makes sense. So hopefully that clarifies that. I think this broader question of colonial identity is quite interesting. It's something so I have variation across my data in areas that had sort of more or less that we think would have more or less exposure to the colonial state, right? So some of local governments I've worked in were home to a colonial officer was posted there for most of the time, or they had a school during the colonial era, right? Things that I think we would think would sort of create sort of a more robust engagement, sort of with, not robust engagement, but more exposure to sort of like colonial norms or sort of expectations or forms of politics, right? Versus villages that are very far away that certainly would be expected to pay taxes and this type of stuff, but sort of probably were able to escape more of the like direct day-to-day interference of the colonial state. I don't really see a big distinction between those areas. I actually have heard some actually kind of interesting stories. I don't want to overstate the nature of these, but like some interesting stories about villages that feel that they would have been better off if they'd been closer to the colonial state, which of course is like certainly not to say that they like wish they'd been colonized more. But like there's one local government, one very large village that, you can read this in the historical records as well, that had like a influential political leader in the pre-colonial era, and the French really wanted to build the railroad that goes into Mali through there. And when I was doing work there, they'd resisted, right? They said like we don't want this railroad anywhere near us, and so the French built it like 8 kilometers to the north. And that town that like formed where the railroad is now like a pretty, there's just more economic opportunity, right, than sort of in this larger village. It like has like a dirt path that you take to get there, and so like the village chief there today was like, that was a mistake. Like we would just have more economic opportunity there today. So if that is the type of thing that I've heard about like exposure to the colonial state, and again, I'm going to be very careful about how I say this. But I think some of those areas, I think maybe the biggest impact of sort of that direct colonial exposure was sort of that these areas did see more infrastructure, and in particular links to markets that I think did create have arguably created more economic activity today. But yeah, it's an anecdote, so we shouldn't read too much into it.
So Ayajan has a question building directly on this. So that's sort of getting at how colonialism might have affected the infrastructure or the distribution of public goods. But Ayajan is curious about if you've noticed any impacts of colonialism on the hegemonic local identities themselves, if proximity to the colonial state maybe affected these social institutions or identification.
Mm-hmm. So I can't know the extent to which it impacted social institutions, right? I think there's just, that's not the type of thing people record in the archives, and it's certainly not like how people remember these histories today, right? So at a certain point, I just have to say, like, I don't know. But certainly I think there was like enormous impact, right, from colonialism on reshaping these identities. And I think maybe one thing to think about with sort of the idea of like a pre-colonial state is, not only were the sort of colonial states like quite interested in these histories, if only to think about like how they could appropriate them, or sort of, think about these leaderships to their advantage. I think that they provide a nice counterpoint in the popular imagination to sort of the onset of colonization. One thing that I think makes Senegal or like Francophone West Africa particularly useful for studying this type of thing is that the French actually sort of completely dismantled these political hierarchies. So there's one exception of the King of Sin is allowed to stay in place until he dies in 1969, after which point, like, his children, they do not keep that throne alive. But so by like 1900, all of these kings have been officially, they're not recognized as figureheads for these polities, right? I mean, obviously their families continue to sort of talk about that, right? And sort of many of the elites that I talk about are sort of, claim descent from noble families and these types of things. But that, these identities are persisting like within at like the village level, like among village chiefs and their claims to the pre-colonial state. It's not so much that like there's figureheads that continue to exist that can sort of can be a focal point, arguably, for these local narratives. So, I mean, in that sense, the French actually sort of dismantled to a degree these states. But in so doing, like, I don't know, like maybe that actually sort of in its own way created a focal point for keeping them alive. But I mean, unfortunately, there's like a lot that I can't see in that process. But I think unlike like in British colonialism, where we sort of see, I mean, stereotypically at least, right, where we sort of see more of a maintenance and sort of a reification of these customs, the French really aren't interested in or explicitly sort of actually dismantling them. I hope that answers your question.
No, it's interesting to hear reflections on these historical facts. If anybody has any last minute questions for Dr. Wilfahrt, now would be the time to submit those. I'm going to ask you one last question, unless other people want to submit questions. So Felipe asks how corruption is related with high and low congruencies. Again, probably something that might be hard for you to observe, but if you heard any anecdotes or have ideas about
people are very open about buying votes or trying to buy votes. Yeah, so I think it exists everywhere. So like in the third case of Kumpentum, there was a very I mean, I think that mayor was like egregiously corrupt, right? I mean, so like I attended like the local budget meeting. I mean, and it was like people were angry. They were shouting because he bought these like millet mills for like this exorbitant price. I mean, it's just like, I mean, and like he had no receipts, I mean, so I mean, I think that I think maybe one way to think about it, or one thing I think might be happening, but I don't have data on, is that there is something about like that act of the existence of those social norms that like circumscribes how corrupt you can be in cases of high congruence. But certainly, I mean, there's no reason to think that I have an anecdotal evidence that sort of corruption is still happening in those areas. It's just maybe on a lower scale, and it's not as like egregious, right? This doesn't necessarily make it better, right? But I mean, similarly, things like vote buying. I mean, people in historically centralized areas like told me that they, would give out money to prominent people but they would sort of describe it as like a norm. Well, like, oh, well, I have to give small bills to all of these, these chiefs or these like influence leaders or opinion leaders in these villages, right? So, I mean, I think money is circulating in less than democratically ideal ways in all of these communities. But I think that sort of there might be sort of bounds on sort of how that is done in historically centralized areas, is my sense. But again, this is not something that I was able to collect systematic data on. Some people were really willing to talk about it, and some people were quite unwilling to do so.
Well, on that note, I'm sure, again, there is just a spontaneous applause erupting across Norman right now. We really want to thank you so much for coming and giving this really empirically rich talk. And yeah, again, we wish we were here in person, but happy you made time for us. And for students in my political economy development class, we will be reconvening in 30 minutes via a different Zoom link that you can find on the Canvas page. But thank you again to
for your great questions,
for joining us, and to Dr. Martha Wilfahrt.